But what we can absolutely control, if we're mindful of it, if we work at it, if we choose to do it, is our perspective in dealing with these circumstances.
Welcome to The Profitable Table, fed by Woolco Foods, a podcast at the nexus of hospitality, business, culture, and the mind. Now here's your host, Woolco Foods CEO, Steven Toboroff.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Profitable Table, fed by Woolco Foods. I am your host, Steven Toboroff, and today I'm going to do a podcast that I believe will have a very broad and far-reaching level of influence for people, or level of interest for people, well beyond business. I was actually going to do a podcast because a few episodes ago I did a critique of Nietzsche, and these philosophy episodes get a lot of hits. And I was going to do an episode where I was incorporating the thinking and writings of Carl Jung as a way to perhaps give a more upbeat interpretation or a different interpretation of a work of Nietzsche's called Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But after speaking with a close friend of mine, he said, or he suggested to me, that I do a podcast that's a bit broader rather than hyper-focusing on something that's very niche. People may not know or be familiar with or interested in Jung or Nietzsche. So I'm going to do a philosophical podcast today, but it's a much broader one. And the crux of this podcast is going to put forth the notion that the very concept of having a personality is a form of neurosis and is something that is not optimal, whether in business or in life. Because the reality is that the biggest cause of suffering that all of us have is our mind and our thinking and our perception of things and the way that we interact with the world. It doesn't mean that there aren't exogenous factors that can be very unpleasant or destabilizing to our equilibrium. But there's an awful lot of things that occur that we generate for ourselves as sources of misery and discomfort. And I propose that a lot of that emanates from this thing we call our personality or ourselves. And so I want to sort of challenge the concept and perhaps explore the subject of, one, does this thing we call our personality serve us in any way? And two, if we realize that it doesn't serve us or doesn't serve us in an optimal way, what is the best way to sort of analyze that and deal with it? And I'm going to suggest that rather than traditional psychoanalysis or psychology, which is the most commonly used modality, I think it's philosophy. And I know that there's a school of psychology called cognitive therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is heavily reliant on philosophy. But for the purposes of this podcast, I want to explore two concepts. One, what is the personality, and is it helpful, or is it just a neurosis? And two, if we agree that it is a source of a problem, if it is a source of our suffering, what is the best way to unpack it and cultivate a better and more nourishing and constructive relationship with our mind? Is it through philosophy or psychoanalysis? And I'm going to suggest it's through philosophy. So to jump in, let's sort of unpack a little bit what I mean by psychology, psychoanalysis, and what I mean by philosophy for purposes of this podcast. Because, of course, they're very broad subjects, but I'm going to try to hone in on them a little bit and make them more actionable and narrow. So psychoanalysis, for lack of a better word, is really the form of talk therapy. It started as talk therapy. There's many different schools of psychoanalysis, but I'm going to focus on two schools, which I think it's very fair to say are incredibly significant within the realm of psychoanalysis. One is Freudian psychoanalysis, and the other is Jungian, which is much less so, but nonetheless relevant, but certainly Freud. So talk therapy is predicated on the idea that an individual goes to a therapist and begins talking about their past, talking about things that have traumatized them, talking about things that are bothering them, upsetting them. And the therapist is there to listen and at times offer suggestions, at times offer statements. But Freudian analysis, in my mind, has a lot of problems with it because when we go back and we start with his seminal text, Interpretation of Dreams, before we even get into the other aspects of Freud, why do we believe that Freud's theories are appropriate or correct in analyzing our dreams? I mean, are they more correct than a shaman that might analyze people's dreams in different cultures? How do we know that his interpretations are correct? They are an interpretation, for sure. If the interpretation serves you, that's great. People have always tried to disentangle what dreams mean. But I think the notion that Freud or Jung, with his collective unconscious and archetypes, that they have the answer to that question, I think is very presumptuous and suspect, which isn't to say that the concept of an unconscious or the concept of the ego or the id or other sort of definitions within the context of psychoanalysis are not helpful. But I challenge the notion that there's a true definitive interpretation of dreams. And another dimension of Freud's philosophy, not a dimension, a fundamental bulwark of it, is everything is sexual or psychosexual. That we have this desire, if you're a man, to sleep with your mother, to kill our fathers, which he calls the Oedipal complex from the play Oedipus the King, that women have this thing called penis envy, and that everything can be reduced to sexual or psychosexual explanation. And he goes on with other things that, fantasies can often be a death wish. The things we're afraid of are oftentimes fantasies. So suffice it to say, he has a lot of very novel theories about why we think the way we think, what's going on in our unconscious. None of them are empirical. And I would argue that they're not necessarily helpful or constructive, nor would I say that they're right. They may very well, and this is something Jung certainly believed and writes about in his autobiography, that this obsession with sex and these issues with the father may have been heavily idiosyncratic to Freud. And then, of course, Freud was an energetic individual, did a lot of writing, and lo and behold, he's perhaps thrust his neuroses upon the world, one theory. Then you have Jung. Now, Jung is much more open-minded, much more interesting to me. I think he was more of a decent person, Jung, but he also has some very clear ideas which are rather far-fetched, that there's a collective unconscious, that there are these mythological truths that permeate the unconscious and that the collective unconscious transcends individuals, that we're sort of tapping into this thing. It has a very spiritual component to it, but I'm not sure that in and of itself it's a constructive foundation for helping people deal with their quote-unquote issues, that it's the most efficacious, the most wholesome, the most appropriate. Now, as a therapist, Jung himself was quite flexible and seemed to be, very much interested in helping his patients. But the point that I'm making for purposes of this podcast is when we talk about psychoanalysis, it involves individuals coming in and repeating to the therapist their memories of the past, many of them traumatic. It relies on the therapist to give these interpretations of these memories. The memories themselves may just be stories. We don't know if the individual's remembering things correctly. We don't know why these memories are important. We don't know a lot of it. But all of this is explored in therapy for the outcome of hopefully helping a person become less neurotic, more self-aware, more able to tap into their intellect. That's sort of my understanding of therapy in a real sort of thumbnail sketch. It really amplifies storytelling, in my view, in a negative way, because we're amplifying and repeating things that we perceive to have been and that may have actually been quite traumatic. We're hyper-focusing on this, and there's absolutely a bias towards a victimization view of the world and of oneself. You were victimized. How do we overcome it? Were you justified? That's one potential interpretation. And then another is just sort of dwelling in sad memories. I question if that's a helpful use of the mind. I wonder if that isn't just regressive and negative. And then the final thing I wonder on is, what is the role of the therapist in all of this? Why do we think that the therapist is capable of working you through these things rather than the individual taking a more philosophical approach that I'm going to get into? And a philosophical approach, in my view, would be to understand that you, the individual, are generating the thoughts. You, the individual, get to assign whatever significance you want, if any, to the thoughts. You, the individual, get to work with your mind to create the way that you process things so that you can move forward into life in a better, more whole, joyous manner. Now, is there some overlap in this with psychoanalysis? Yes, but there's not overlap from the Freudian perspective. There's not overlap from the Jungian perspective. And so therein, I think, is a problem, because it, again, back to the second part of the podcast, it deals with personality disorders and how to sort of reconcile them. And I'm thinking that the very notion of a personality itself may be a disorder, and maybe it's something we don't need, and we'll get to that later. So let's talk a little bit about what philosophy is as opposed to my understanding of analysis, psychoanalysis. In philosophy, it's the act of questioning in search of a productive self. So within philosophy, it starts from the notion that the individual who's doing the thinking is seeking an answer or an explanation or an approach to lead to a constructive life. The foundational layer of this is not victimization, if you will. It begins with a reliance on critical thinking, and it begins with a conscious, let's use psychoanalytic terms here, conscious understanding that the real power here resides with the thinker, the individual, not the unconscious, okay? When you place a premium on the unconscious, and for sure something exists there, we know that our mind is always working, whether we're focusing on something or not. It's the nature of the mind. We know that we have dreams. Dreams are incredibly complicated and inexplicable things, but there are a lot of definitions of them and explanations. Freud has some. Certain religions say that when we're asleep, our souls ascend to heaven and we're interacting in that dimension, and then they return into our body when we awake. There's many schools of thought as to what dreams are. To be sure, they're very mysterious, very important, and worthy of thinking about. But when it comes to living a life of actualization and joy, and certainly when it comes to living a life when we're interacting with other humans in an impactful way, which is very important in business, the philosophical approach, which again begins with the notion that the mind is going to ask questions, and that the questioning mind is what's relevant here. And so therefore it automatically puts power within the thinking part of ourselves rather than the non-thinking part. And then the final part about philosophy is there's multiple texts, there's multiple books, there's multiple approaches. There's no ossified, predetermined, highly specious meanings, quote unquote, that is assigned to things. Now, there are absolutely different schools of philosophical thought. If you're reading Schopenhauer and you attach significance to pessimism, that's no better than being a Freudian and attaching significance to Freudian thinking. I'm thinking more about somebody who takes philosophy as a broader concept of thinking, questioning, reviewing things with the active and critical mind to reach the conclusion, ultimately, that the mind both processes and creates information simultaneously, and that different philosophical thinkers can have a big impact on that. So let me give a couple of schools of thought and philosophy that I think are the most helpful and most appropriate for purpose of this podcast. Stoicism. I've done a few podcasts on Stoicism. Stoicism is very popular right now. But to simplify Stoicism as much as I can, the objective in Stoicism is to harmonize yourself with the world around you and to get very clear on understanding what it is you can control and what you can't control. and understanding that what you can control is your mind and your thinking, and what you can't control is everything else. Now, Nietzsche, who was a critic of Stoicism, viewed it as nothing more than a sort of vulgar self-discipline for losers or unlucky people to cope with unsatisfying circumstances in their lives. And I think that's one of the more unfortunate and simplistic and foolish interpretations of Nietzsche, of any type of thinking. Because when you read the writings of Epictetus and you read the writings of Marcus Aurelius, what it's really about, at least as I read it, is to understand that there's a whole world outside of us that we're interacting with that we can't control. We can't control if it rains or not. We can't control if the person that we want to have a pleasant discussion with is in a bad mood. We can't control if our car gets stuck in traffic, and on and on and on and on. But what we can absolutely control, if we're mindful of it, if we work at it, if we choose to do it, is our perspective in dealing with these circumstances. Now, this to me is an extraordinarily powerful and healthy and constructive way to go through life, because it empowers the individual to actually work on and utilize that which is in their control, rather than allowing themselves to be turned into an emotional kaleidoscope where they're constantly reacting predictably to circumstances that are out of their control, thereby giving up agency. So that's Stoicism. Let's talk about Descartes and his meditations. Descartes' famous line, "I think, therefore I am." Okay, so the way I interpret that is that the fact that we are thinking not only validates the notion that we exist to ourselves, but that the thinking in and of itself is what's creating our reality, the amness of the whole thing. And some of it is done without us being mindful of it, and some of it is done acutely, deliberatively by us. But again, the agency, the power, the liberation, the opportunity resides within the thinker, not the unconscious, not the trauma of the past, not stories about the past, not stories about other people who we have no idea what they were thinking, but about ourselves and our thinking. What about Søren Kierkegaard? Here we have Kierkegaard, who explicitly brings God into the dynamic, but so does Epictetus. So that in philosophy, not all philosophers, but many philosophers, St. Augustine for the Catholics, Christians, Hasidic philosophy for Jews, I'm sure there's Islamic philosophers. The philosopher who acknowledges God as the creator, and of course Epictetus makes the argument in his discourses that, and this is the sort of designer argument, that we see the complexity around us, yet we want to think it's all random, yet nothing we see in life that is strictly banal and human in nature, that has any degree of complexity to it, simply falls into existence. But we think this entire multiplex existence we live in, that we only have a fraction of the capacity to understand due to the limitations of our brain, some people would like to convince themselves that this is merely a matter of happenstance. Well, Kierkegaard says no, or Epictetus says no, and they create, Kierkegaard does, a philosophy, and he has a lot of different writings, but certainly that one begins with understanding that there's a creator of the universe, and we have an opportunity to exist and to appreciate the beauty of the creation of God. And in so doing, to again try to harmonize ourselves with this, taking the focus into something much broader and more nourishing than the hyper-focusing, if you will, on narratives and stories about the past and repetition, which may or may not be true, and certainly are only true to the extent that we assign meaning to them. Okay? So that's sort of a very brief explanation of how I distinguish philosophy from psychoanalysis. And of course, these are massive subjects, and there's therapists that are Adlerian that are much more in tune with philosophical approaches. And there are philosophers that would probably be much more in tune. I mean, even some of Plato's writing, if you read sections of the Republic, there's a lot of multidimensional stuff going on there. But for purposes of this podcast, I think I've delineated the difference between the two. So now let's get to the essence of the discussion, which is if we agree that a big source of our suffering, the biggest source is ourselves, our thinking. And I'm suggesting it comes from the personality. Well, what is the personality? What is our personality? And do we ever stop and think about it? Do we ever stop and think about how much of our lives is impacted based upon how we perceive ourselves? And how that perception of ourselves, which has absolutely no basis in objective reality, but is in many ways just a creation, a defense mechanism. So what is the self? Well, a very basic example is if you were brought up, and this is using a theory of a psychologist, Alice Miller, Drama of the Gifted Child. If you were brought up, I'm oversimplifying it here, but it's a simple concept, so I'll just use it like this. If you grew up as somebody who received immense praise from your parents when you did well in school, or if you were a ballet dancer, you were great at dancing as a child. If you were a child who felt that the love that you received, the validation you received from your parents was predicated upon your ability to be exceptional in certain things, and you're not aware of that, you may go through your whole life burdened by the idea that you have to constantly be excellent in something, because if you're not, then you cease to have validity, you'll no longer be lovable, and you may develop all kinds of issues because you're not aware of this whole personality you've created for yourself based upon when you were a child. When we're children and when we're growing up, we don't have experience and we have limited language. So as we grow up and as we evolve into being adults, we develop this thing called a personality which enables us to navigate life. Sometimes the personality enables us to get love from our parents. Sometimes it enables us to get respect from our peers. Sometimes it enables us to instill fear in people. Sometimes it enables us to be perceived as attractive by people. But whatever this personality is, it's a construct that we create, almost like a suit of clothing, to navigate life. And you can understand why you do it as a child because you have limited life experience and you have limited vocabulary. But does it make sense for an adult? So in other words, if I'm an adult, and let's use it in the context of business. Let's say I'm about to have a business luncheon with somebody that's set up for me by an associate. I'm going to have lunch with someone who's in the hospitality industry. And my associate who sets it up says, listen, you're going to be having lunch with a guy named John. He's an extremely successful restaurateur, has houses all over the United States and Europe, loves to read literature, magnificent skier, and has a true passion for art. But I want you to have lunch with this individual because you're in the hospitality business. He is. He's got concepts all over the world and they're extraordinarily successful. So now, from my perspective, when I go to the lunch, if I go to the lunch with the notion that, oh, wow, this guy's really successful, I need to convey to him that I'm also unique and special in some exogenous way. So I need to tell him where I went to college. I need to tell him what kind of car I have. I better bring the conversation around to where I've traveled because I want to appear worldly. I better make sure that I let him know that I love Mark Rothko, the artist. So in other words, if I start bringing to this discussion all of this inner dialogue, my personality, so that I can portray it to this person because I'm feeling that I need to convey something, otherwise I won't be validated. Well, I think if I do that, I'm going to have a very dissatisfying or suboptimal conversation. And for what purpose? To satisfy an inner dialogue I'm having that has nothing to do with outside reality. But what if I go to the lunch and I just simply say, wow, I'm really looking forward to meeting this individual. He sounds interesting. And I particularly want to learn more about his thoughts on the hospitality industry in other parts of America and see if there's other trends that might be relevant in my market. In other words, what if I go to the lunch and have no real trace of that multi-dimensional architecture that I just described to you, and I can go there and just exist and listen and speak without all that additional energy and need. I think it would be more efficacious. I think it'd be more enjoyable. And yet, I can speak for myself because I'm acutely aware I used to do this when I was younger. I would have been exactly the former person. And I think for people who listen to this, if they're honest with themselves, they'll notice the same thing. Now, oftentimes, if you do have that awareness, you can make a choice not to do it, and then you're going to be able to experience things in a much more holistic and appropriate manner. That type of thinking, in my view, comes from a philosophical approach. The philosophical approach, through understanding the agency that I have as a thinker, as a human, I don't have to bring baggage or notions of the past or notions of identity or personality to anything. What I want to do is I want to experience the dynamic, the lunch, the person, the information in the most unobstructed manner possible. And in so doing, I'll not only be an actualized human being, but I'll be doing something very constructive. So in that case, I would say that a personality doesn't serve me. And I've shared with you how a philosophical approach would deconstruct the personality. And we could go through other philosophers. What would a psychoanalytic approach be? Well, it might say, look, I feel insecure, but I am justified because my mother used to make me feel insecure relative to my brother or my sister, and that's not the way it is. And I've developed this personality that's aware of that, and I'm going to really show people, hey, these are my valid points. Or perhaps another approach psychoanalytically might be to just, rather than understanding that the thought that might come up, which would be, wow, this individual I'm going to have lunch with has a lot of impressive attributes, that's making me feel a certain way, and then sort of just nipping it in the bud there, saying, yeah, but whatever you're feeling, whatever your perception is, you're the mind that's creating it. In psychoanalysis, we might be led to a different path, saying, well, why are you feeling that way? Well, of course, you're going to answer that question because the mind answers any question that you give it. Will you give it an authentic answer? Is it a worthwhile question? Is it even a question? Would it not be better to get right to the chase? These are just suggestions. I don't know. But what I do believe and what I've seen in my own life is that the more that we can eradicate this notion of a personality, which is a metaphor for a shield or a sword that we have to project before us into the world so that we think we're going to convey something to other people that we think will validate us in their minds. Part one, which of course we have no idea because we don't know what's in another person's mind. Or even worse, if we're so unaware that we need this personality because we need to validate ourselves to ourselves, that's even worse. Because why would you need to tell yourself a story about yourself? Why couldn't you just exist and be with yourself and think critically? So that's an example. I hope it's been a clear example of how a personality can be a damaging or unproductive thing in your life. Now just extrapolate this to all of your relationships and all of your interactions and ask yourself, when you really go into things, whether it's new information, new people, do you go into those environments comfortable, relaxed, attentive, aware, in the moment? Or do you go into those moments nervous, hyper-focusing on yourself, hyper-focusing on how people are going to perceive you, hyper-focusing on how you want to be perceived? And if it's the latter, I'm going to argue that that's not optimal. And then the question is, how do we deal with that? And I'm going to suggest that the way to deal with it is, one, be aware of it. I'm very aware myself that for so many years of my life, I was absolutely the type of person that would have to have all these exogenous props, whether it was clothing or whatever the hell it was. You guys, I'm sure, can understand what I'm saying here, to validate me both to myself and to the people that I was dealing with. And it wasn't until I started to read seriously in philosophy, even though I was very familiar with the writings of Freud and others from my time in college, that psychoanalysis and Freudian thinking and other stuff almost serve to reinforce the personality by giving it a certain flavor or a certain twist or a certain exoticness to it, but never really dealing with it, never really getting to the issue. And the issue is that whatever thoughts are being generated by me, they're not shoved into my head by some third-party immutable force that I have no say over. They're created by me. And therefore, if they're created by me, they can be changed and they can be different creations. And then once you understand that, you understand the mind, then you start asking yourself, okay, so why do I need all this inner drama? Why can't I just exist? Now, I'm not saying to be like the cynics and Diogenes and show up after living in a garbage can dressed like a bum. No, we live in society. We have to behave in a manner that is accustomed to society and accustomed to what you do in life. If you're a business person, you need to dress appropriately, speak appropriately, interact appropriately because you're engaging with other people. But that's very different than having a massive inner dialogue going on at all times that gets in the way. So I'm going to propose that the optimal way to live life as a business person and as any other person is to be able to exist and interact with having as few filters between you and, for lack of a better word, reality as possible. Now, reality, of course, is a subjective thing that we create in part. But by using the example of having lunch with another person or going into a social setting or beginning the process of learning something new, the more we can eliminate this personality of ours, whatever it may be, I'm smart, I'm a hard worker, you are what you are. When you start defining it, who are you defining it to? You're defining it to yourself so that it's an inner set of clothes that explains you to yourself, or you want to go around the world and be perceived a certain way. Remember, if you're concerned about your personality and that to you means what other people will think of you, you don't have to worry about that. Other people are going to devise whatever they think of you based upon, one, their own sort of biases, and two, how you behave towards them, and three, does it matter? And if you're defining yourself to yourself, that definitely doesn't matter. What that should be is just simply existing and enjoying and participating in things and evolving and learning and developing without the pressure or the distraction of a personality nagging at you all the time to be a certain way, be perceived a certain way, act a certain way. No, I don't think that makes sense. And that's the concept I wanted to share. I can tell you for myself that so often when I have discussions with people, I can actually see them working so hard to play a part when they're talking to me. And they're not doing it to satisfy me, although maybe in some cases they are. A lot of times they're doing it to satisfy their own sense of themselves. It's not in every case, but whenever I see it, I say to myself, man, this is really sad because it's so unnecessary. You know, if you and I are getting together for dinner and we start a conversation because we both like literature and you start telling me about why you like Dickens and I start talking to you about, why I like Dostoevsky, I think it's best if we just talk, listen, share, rather than bring that personality dynamic into it. And in business, for sure, you can make a lot of mistakes with a strong personality within, because you're going to defend that personality and act out of that personality, even when objective reality and facts are not in alignment with your behavior. And while I'm never going to say for anybody what they should do, this is a suggestion. I think analysis and seeking help in that way, that's for each individual to do. And again, whatever works, I think taken at its purest form, psychology can be a terrific thing. Once you get to the point of activating your intellect, and once you get to the point of being self-aware. What I don't like to see is when people are either trapped in a formalized modality of thinking, such as Freudian analysis or Jungian analysis. Just don't think that every person needs to force their thoughts, their ideas, their existence into the theories of these two individuals, among others. That doesn't make sense to me. but I could be wrong. That's for other people to say. On the other hand, I think talk therapy, if it really is designed to gain an understanding of oneself and gain an understanding of the power we have over our own minds, the ability to understand that we generate our own thoughts, including the anxious and the frightening ones, as well as the inspiring ones, then that's great. But I did just want to go through all this because, just on a personal level, having come to philosophy late in life, it's really had an enormously eye-opening and positive experience for me. And I wanted to share my thoughts on the subject. I hope that this was more, at least interesting and enjoyable for more people than a discussion on a text of Nietzsche and another scholar's interpretation of it as I see it. So I thank everybody for listening. If you enjoyed this content and you know other people who would as well, please share this podcast. Would love to hear comments. One of my favorite things is when I get thoughtful emails or DMs from people who disagree with me and have a different perspective. If you have a different approach and a different understanding of Freud or Jung, or you completely disagree with what I've said, I would love to hear that as well, because I think that's how we learn. And I realize that these are very complicated subjects, and I only went through them in the most brief and cursory manner, but I would think that the most lasting point that I would like to stimulate some thought in people on is be mindful of this thing you may have, called a personality, and ask yourself if it's truly serving you. It's a question I asked myself. It's something that I looked at, and happy to share with you the answers that I came up with. But by all means, it's just one person's opinion, and I always love to hear contrary opinions and contrary perspectives. So in any event, I want to thank you again for listening. If you like it, please like. Love to see the comments. Really helps boost the attention of the podcast and the algorithm. Would love to hear from you. And beyond that, I just want everybody to have an awesome day.
Thank you for listening to The Profitable Table, fed by Woolco Foods. Please be sure to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. And to learn more about Woolco Foods or Steven Toboroff, please visit us at woolcofoods.net.